generation is how do we learn from nature and how do we apply nature's patterns to how we organize as humans as part of nature.
Hi, my name is Dave, and this is the Light Forest Podcast, a journey of exploration to bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. Hello, and welcome to the Light Forest Podcast. This is episode 2 of season 0, and I'm so delighted that you could join me for this episode. At Light Forest, the idea of regeneration is front and center. You'll see it on the podcast descriptions, you'll see it on the website. For me, regeneration has been interesting, has captured my imagination, because I think it implies this sense of a paradigm shift in moving forward, as well as this connection with nature. Looking at the Cambridge Dictionary, you will see it's defined as change or improving through renewal, spiritual revival, rebirth, and retaining a sense of balance with nature. So here, this idea of death and rebirth and a renewal. Now, the etymology of this term has its roots in biology, but the concept has been extended to encompass a range of disciplines, often used around the improving of the health of systems. Now, unlike the term sustainability, which implies sustaining the equilibrium or status quo paradigm, regeneration, I think, hits closer to both the scale and the form of paradigm shifts we're interested in. And then there's a bonus part with the re. For me, that re also involves a recognition and a remembrance of ancient wisdoms and practices that once governed our lives, governed our world, yet over time they've been forgotten, they've been discarded, they've been perhaps considered to be backward, to be unmodern, to be unscientific. And I think as we move forward, as we try to think of new technologies, new ways of being, new ways of governing, it's just as important to remember our true nature, because in many ways that also reflects this journey of life that we're all on. So take a breath. In the book One Straw Revolution by Masanobu Fukuoka, who is a philosopher, farmer, agricultural pioneer living in Japan through the mid-20th century and pioneering a form of natural farming, Masanobu writes, pondering the question, what is the natural pattern? To the extent that trees deviate from their natural form, pruning and insect extermination becomes necessary. To the extent that human society separates itself from a life close to nature, schooling becomes necessary. He brings up an example of pruning a fruit tree or an orchard tree, where once an unnatural process of pruning begins, then it disrupts the natural patterns and requires continued pruning and continued human intervention in order to prevent leaves from being tangled, in order to prevent sequences disrupting sunlight, and finally leading to insect damage and tree dying. And so he brings light to the fact that a tree that was never tampered with will retain in its own way a sense of growth and a sense of natural patterns, and a reminder that, as we are in our world today, we're dealing with a world that has been disrupted, tampered with, modified, changed in so many ways. And when I say the world, I'm even referring to our own minds, that it's really this regeneration is the only way forward for us to remember and find again these natural patterns and natural flows. Now, my own recent interest into regeneration or seeing the word a lot has actually happened in my interactions and my reading in the Web3 space. Now, by Web3, I'm referring to, let's say, a bundle of technologies that are largely built on decentralized networks. I'm referring to the blockchain, cryptocurrency, smart contracts, decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. And what I've come to find is a fascinating meeting of people, humans, who recognize the sort of state of our planet and recognize the need for regeneration, and are really looking at using these technologies towards catalyzing or bringing forth regeneration in many different ways. And that's what this episode is about in many ways. We have with us Maya Dentzel, who's going to take us on a journey into both the concept of regeneration and how it's informing a new brand of economics known as regenerative economics, as well as we get to know and learn more about the ReFi tribe and the kinds of new tools and solutions that are being built here. Maya is a researcher and social entrepreneur passionate about building regenerative systems with emerging technologies. She has written about and organized events on regenerative finance, aka ReFi. Her current work puts her at the intersection of global climate action efforts and Web3, and among several projects she's involved in, she's also co-host of season 4 of the ReFi podcast. So there's a few better people we could have to share more about the intersections of Web3 and regeneration. And she shares her firsthand experience learning some of the tools around transparency, around democratization of funding, as well as a new initiative around biodiversity credits, which is one of the new projects that are aiming to support indigenous community stewardship in the Amazon. Now, the Web3 space, of course, is also associated with a lot of, let's call it, degenerative activities in our planet. And I think it's important to recognize this as well. And Maya also continuously refers back to this need for balance and that the space is still new, it's still growing, it's still evolving. But I think what's really important is you have a meeting of people who are motivated with these intentions. You have this emergent technology that has a potential to be guided in such a way. And you have opportunities emerging now and a market emerging that's probably allowing a wonderful symbiosis of all these streams. So all that's to say is I was really enjoyed this conversation with Maya. You will hear her kindness, her thoughtfulness, her insight really come through in the way she explains a lot of these ideas, as well as shares a little bit in her own life and her own story and what led her to where she is today. She is also a yoga teacher and is deeply inspired and deeply guided by a lot of the principles in terms of how she lives, the projects she chooses to work on, and how she sees the world and its process of regeneration. So with that, welcome Maya to the Light Forest podcast.
Thanks, Dave, for having me. I'm so excited to see your kernel adventure evolve in such cool and creative ways. You really are inspiring me to be more creative, actually.
Yeah, let's do it. So I'd love to invite you to kick us off to maybe share or describe a world that resonates with your vision of regeneration and the role that regenerative technologies can play in this.
Sure. When I envision like this world where regenerative systems thrive, I think the first kind of reference I have in my head is this like solar punk vision. And I don't know for listeners how familiar you are with the solar punk. It's kind of this like futuristic view of the new vibrant world with like green cities, like powered by renewable energy, technology, nature living in a holistic, balanced way. So, and I think that's a great starting point, and that's sort of my inspiration for the kind of world I see. The first things that come to mind, like vibrance, full of creativity, thriving, and I'm sensing like lush greenery, and just like high vibration energy in this place. And I guess when it comes to kind of more specifics, right? And I recently came back from Tulum, and what inspired me there in terms of built environment is their regenerative architecture. So the cool thing they do there is that kind of newer developments are built with nature, not on top of nature. So we went to this really cool regenerative project there where they only use, natural materials, that goes without saying, but they also design buildings in a way that mimic nature patterns. They design in a smart way that when the water flows naturally, you sort of build a water collecting point on the natural path of the water. You also create, smart electricity grids, right? Obviously solar and all other innovations, hopefully peer-to-peer energy grids. And that's where, when we start introducing some of these technologies, that's where Web3 comes into play, in my view. Like, because, for example, if we want to allow peer-to-peer energy exchanges and reduce reliance on centralized power sources that, are prone to collapses, especially with increased, devastating natural events, disasters, hurricanes. So smart contracts can kind of automate this energy exchange, because oftentimes with solar energy, there's a lot of residual energy that may not be used otherwise. And how cool would it be if neighbors could just like trade energy back and forth, when they need it? So obviously, in terms of, so that we talked about built environment, energy, then the way people commute and travel. Obviously, I'm a huge pedestrian advocate. I think as much as we can introduce pedestrian, bike-friendly, electric vehicles, hope flying cars, and definitely things to be public spaces built for pedestrian friendly pathways. Obviously when we talk about like the kinds of like products and value exchanges that people are going to have in this like beautiful new regenerative future that we're building towards, the circulation of goods and products is, matters. Obviously, instead of this predominance of never endless consumption, how cool would it be if like new creative ways of reusing, repurposing, recycling, upcycling were introduced? And kind of taking it back to Web3, for the production of these goods and the certification of their ethical practices, we do need distributed ledgers, right? Or kind of a layer that ensures transparency among actors, right? And that's another kind of useful application of blockchain. And also, kind of just so we're clear, I'm not a blockchain evangelist. I don't see that blockchain is a panacea for all world's problems. It is a technology, it's a tool, and it can be useful in certain, environments and applications. But again, I hope that the audience doesn't think of me as like, okay, blockchain is going to save the world. Now, we'll talk maybe more later about how, when there is a specific need for this decentralized layer, that's where it should be applied. And oftentimes there's no need for that. And I guess moving beyond sort of infrastructure, products, transportation, like what matters to me the most is how these, citizens or people of this regenerative world feel and live. And the most important thing, that the communities are supported, that they feel connected, there's a sense of unity and purpose, and people feel fulfilled. And also the most important thing in my dreamy view of this regenerative future is that people feel connected to each other and connected to nature, right? And that's what regeneration really means. Basically, that as cliche as it sounds, as we are nature, we're not separate from it. And I think this sense of disconnection that people have in this modern world that we live in, that's what brings all this kind of exploitative attitude towards nature around us and other people, and causes so much suffering, which is really unfortunate. And when I also think about fulfillment, I also think about like, okay, we're gonna have all these new technologies, Web3, but also including AI, that's going to automate like most of mundane, kind of monotonous tasks, and people often get scared about it. It's like, oh my gosh, we're going to lose our jobs. But then I like to think is that, okay, if we can automate some of the things we don't want to do, maybe this will give us space to do the things we want to do. And what I mean by that is creativity, creation. And that's, I think, is the fundamental purpose of us being on this planet. So, besides this like lush green, kind of futuristic looking regenerative buildings and happy communities, I also see a lot of art, a lot of self-expression, and a lot of like peer learning and education, a lot of gatherings, again, like reconnection to each other, kind of. I was listening to some podcasts and they said something like, well, back in the day, people would gather around the fire and tell stories and co-evolve like that. And now we sit in our rooms with our phones by ourselves. And so it would be cool to bring kind of a modern sitting by the fire element in these regenerative communities. And when we think about like peer learning, an important aspect of learning is access to information. And that's actually where blockchain can also come into place in terms of like open sourced protocols, open knowledge, right? Get rid of paywalls of academic journals and articles. I recently came out of academia, and it's my pet peeve that all these like academic journals and books are so expensive. And then also, but it doesn't mean that everything should be like free. I think like knowledge and knowledge work should be properly rewarded. But then how can we ensure that this reward goes to the creator, right? And that's where, again, Web3 can play a role in terms of, NFT concept, where, creators can kind of build in royalties into their work. It can be a piece of art, it can be a podcast, right, music, and so on and so forth, as well as academic articles. And there's this whole movement, science, decentralized science, that you should definitely chat with someone from there. I'm definitely not an expert there, but there are all these like little things that Web3 can kind of bring together if it's done in a thoughtful way, and if we don't get caught up in this sort of like techno-utopian ideas, and actually focus on people first and on the goals of building regenerative elite. And I guess like lastly, if we talk about people getting together, and we have to talk about the governance, institutions, and alternative ways of governing. And, I think it's no surprise for anyone that, democracies are unfortunately on the decline. And even in so-called democracies like the United States, where I am based currently, this democratic system does not feel as representative of what people really want. So how do we create new ways for people to coordinate, maybe decentralize some of these institutions, allow for more like a local community governance, right? And I think cool things are also emerging with these, pop-up cities and villages, like we discussed with you, the upcoming Zuzalu event in Taiwan. There were previous ones. There's currently Edge City happening in Northern California. It's how do we reimagine these ways for people to form these communities that are not based on where they were born, but based on their principles, values, and interests. And how do we create these decentralized governance models that ensure that, decisions are actually made collectively, and, people heard about concepts of DAOs. And again, I'm not just like pitching DAOify everything. I think DAOs have a lot of issues on their own. So, you know, and again, not everything needs to be a DAO. I do think that there needs to be more local community governance, and it doesn't also mean that we need to just like scratch it all, build anew. It's like, how can we reform existing institutions, for example, and do something even more simple, like put voting on chain, right? So that there's no stupid debate about like whether election is rigged or not, or I feel like we're like so advanced in the society in so many ways, but also so like primitive. That's why, besides regenerating our world and our environments, we too connected on this idea of regenerating within first, and I'm sure we'll get to that. Okay, I'll stop here.
That was beautiful. I like that you started first straight with nature, right? Having sort of lush pastures and trees and grass. I mean, that's sort of definitely the vision of Light Forest as well, of having nature being such a big part of it. And you brought in so many different layers of both like values, people feeling fulfilled, people working, having time to spend on creativity or using the tools that they have towards living with more creativity, and then the sort of technology layer of whether blockchain coming in ways around governance, or allowing electricity grids to be more decentralized, and flying cars even. Of course.
I'm in California. People, talk about this and say like, we're gonna have them next year, and one day.
Yeah.
As long as they're clean, as long as it's not fossil fuel burning flying cars, I'm for it.
Flying close enough to the sun to be solar powered.
That would be cool.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there, and then we'll probably try to unpack some of that in this conversation. One of the words that sort of came up a lot was regeneration. This concept of regeneration. So I wonder if you could help like unpack that for us, how you understand regeneration and what are the kinds of schools of thought that are emerging around this concept of regeneration.
Sure. And I think emerging is the key word in your question. And in fact, I was just at this event on this regenerative farm locally here near where I live. And one of the stewards of the land said something interesting, which I thought like, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Because, in my academic career and even like now, I'm like all about definitions. How do we define things? And I think it's important to have common understanding. But then he said something like that the word to define, like from like Latin, means basically to defini, like to like kill. And if we like define something, right, we put it in this box, and it's kind of like ruins the concept, which obviously I thought it was like an interesting way to put it. And I do think that what's important to then for me to think about is that I think it's still important to define things, but remember that these are all emerging definitions. So there's no like set like this is one thing and that's it, and then judge people. Okay, this is regenerative, this is not regenerative. So to me, like I mentioned earlier, how I understand regeneration, and again, it can be considered like a pretty vague concept for many or unclear. It's like going back from this idea, like we are nature. What does that mean? That nature regenerates naturally. So, we see these like natural cycles that come, that come and go, plants grow and die, and soil constantly cycles through. And, there are these like natural cycles, right? And we are actually also cyclical creatures. And then, but besides nature's cycles, there's this idea that nature has existed, for what, millions of years. We don't even know for how long. And like the amount of intelligence that exists in nature is just like beyond our comprehension. So how can we actually use as nature's intelligence so that we in building our human system? So like basically to me, regeneration is how do we learn from nature and how do we apply nature's patterns to how we organize as humans as part of nature. And another example that people like to use, which I think is useful, is that, everyone talks about sustainability, and, it's been like the buzzword for the past, 20 plus years. But what does sustainability really mean? It's like to sustain things, right? Like sustaining on one level. So if we're basically already harmed our world a lot, enough, and if we will, what are we sustaining, like a meh kind of a dying environment? So instead of sustaining, how can we regenerate? So like build on top of it. And then I think in terms of visuals, regeneration's constant is always drawn as like the spiraling up, right? So how do we add more value than we extract? And to me, this is what's kind of this. It's kind of this new. It's basically a paradigm shift from this sustainability mindset to more of a, okay, how can we acknowledge that the world is much more holistic, right? And again, I think another like third element besides cycles, natural intelligence of the world, and the third aspect of regeneration that I think is crucial is this idea of interconnectedness, right? Everything is relational, and that kind of takes me back to yoga, right? And some of these ideas that we are all one, and this is true, even though we don't directly see it right away, right? If I'm hurting right now, and if my environment in Santa Barbara is hurting, and there's a wildfire in Santa Barbara, it doesn't mean that you automatically will immediately see like a decline in your environment there in Thailand. However, if we accumulate all those things and think of our world as this like living organism, right? So these ills and pains are felt through, and we are a living system after all. And I think we sometimes forget that and see nature as something just like set in stone and not living. And I think another aspect of regeneration that I think the West is kind of recognizing, acknowledging, that's been in practice for thousands of years by native indigenous people who see nature as a living thing, as as mother nature, right? We say mother nature for a reason. And yeah, it just, I guess, a different lens of view in the world. It's this reminder that there's this constant process of renewing, restoring of systems, and it's always relational. And why regeneration as a new paradigm is important in my view is that it is this reminder that we need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with nature, and remind ourselves that we are all one. And so when we design like systems and even organizations, how can we apply some of those principles to our work? So it's kind of like a guiding framework, but it's not just one thing. And I think that's what that land steward who I met meant, is that you can't just say this is the one way of being regenerative, and if you don't do it this way, then you're not regenerative, because then it excludes, right? And again, because nature is abundant, how can we allow abundant ways of expressing regeneration? I don't know if that answered the question, but this is how I view it in my head.
No, that's beautiful. And I think this exploration also includes an exploration of what do we mean when we say regeneration. And I like that you also emphasize that it's emerging, it's changing, evolving, growing. But it does seem that regeneration, I mean, we talked about sustainability being sort of the buzzword or the term of the last 20 years, but it does seem that regeneration is growing is in our consciousness in a way. We're seeing maybe some communities emerge. We're seeing some more fully formed economic ideas emerge, and especially perhaps in opposition to the current sort of neoliberal mainstream economic systems that define our world today. And it's fascinating to see how what you just described of these very deep fundamental shifts in how we relate to each other, how we relate to nature, how we see the sort of oneness, and then how we then build actual systems on that and build actually ways of thinking about how we share value, how we grow together. And that seems to me that the sort of challenge of our time almost. And you're working in the space, and you've been plugged into the refi communities in Web3, but also better understanding and studying some of the economic systems that are coming in the space. So how have you seen, or what are the interesting features that you've seen? Perhaps first on the economic systems of regeneration, and then maybe we can look at some of the actual communities or the sort of applications that you've seen that are coming out that are interesting to you.
Oh, well, I mean, the idea of regenerative economics is fairly new, I would say. Yes, I mean, I don't know, I can trace the whole, history of who was the first person who mentioned it, but it kind of from my recent exploration gained traction only about like 10 years ago or so. And if the way it started for me is I, came across John Fullerton's white paper on regenerative capitalism, and I was like, oh, well, what does that mean? Like, can capitalism be regenerative? But kind of broader into his ideas in regenerative economics, and he has this whole institute dedicated to that specifically, and actually runs these courses. He wrote this white paper, and then there are other thinkers like Kate Raworth, who wrote about donut economics, and these ideas of, I guess, circular economics and kind of the new economic thoughts has been around for like a few decades. But I think this framing of regenerative economics, regenerative business, regenerative organizations has only become more prominent much more recently. So I think it's, again, like we said, it's like ever evolving. And in fact, I never stop learning because there's always something new that that comes up, and that's why I really appreciate John Fullerton's work on educating kind of the broader public. And then in terms of other thought leaders in this kind of regenerative space, like another person who comes to mind is Laura Storm, and she's been a big advocate for regenerative business, but also regenerative leadership, and how it's really important to be guided by people who share these ideas and beliefs, and that this level of consciousness, right? So when we talk about building solutions, the solutions don't exist in a vacuum, right? The solutions are all social, and they're created by people. So it's so important that the builders of these solutions are united by this regenerative vision. So I think those are kind of the key people who like inspired me to dig a little bit deeper. And I'm still, I'm definitely learning. I feel like the more I learn, the less I know. It's like the story of my life. But it's cool to see how some of these ideas on regenerative, systems and businesses and leadership are, gain traction in some of these tech communities. And that's kind of like what got me into this whole thing in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how the different sort of approaches that are emerging, and somehow we've seen this refi space emerge, which I think perhaps to might also need to unpack like what is refi is, and what drew you there. But yeah, it's like um, so regeneration as a concept and some of these communities in blockchain and Web3 started to emerge and come together and look at how we can build more regenerative tech, which I think played such a feature in your own vision of this world where you talked about there's so many different kinds of tools where blockchain's coming in. Yeah, I know you've been organizing various events in the last few months, even across Europe and Mexico, bringing the community together. Yeah, it would be lovely if you could share a little bit about what refi is and how you're seeing, the industry take in some of these systems that you talked about, and bring that into action through some of the tech tools, because that seems to me such a difficult to imagine challenge to actually take some of these values that we talked about earlier and actually bring it into systems and the tech that we build.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge, and I also want to preface that by saying that I'm realizing how much more it is a challenge now as I'm more like hands-on involved. It's like I left academia and now I'm actually seeing how some of these things, are built and talking to people who are building them. And I guess what I realize it's so much easier to sort of like sit back, the comfort of an academic institution and criticize like, oh, this is not regenerative enough, or this is not good, and this is still focuses too much on the free market and it's not good enough. And I guess like I'm just kind of reflecting on my own experience of how sometimes I can be a bit more cynical, thinking like, oh my gosh, all of this like is not gonna work. But then I guess I'm recognizing how important it is still to take action, however imperfect it is, towards reaching these ideals. And then, so some of the things, and there are a lot of caveats to all of these projects, and like none of them, is perfect. And I have my own reservations for like, the direction of ReFi, what it is and where it's going. But I just wanted to acknowledge first that I think that the coolest thing that it exists, and that there are people who take these ideas and experiment and attempt to implement them in our lives in little big ways. So I think that's like the biggest contribution of the space. And I guess I should probably explain what this is. And it's funny because, again, we're back to these definition games. And so ReFi is a play on words from DeFi, right? Decentralized finance, basically some financial tools and instruments that live on the blockchain or Web3. People use that interchangeably oftentimes. So Gregory Landua, actually from Regen Network, was the one who coined the hashtag ReFi. I think like back in 2017 or even earlier. Around then, it's sort of like, okay, how can we actually use these DeFi, decentralized accounting and financial tools to support regeneration, right? Regenerative action. And so that's the play on words and why it's called ReFi. So it's basically how do we connect Web3 tooling and, use all these cool, amazing tools, to promote regeneration and, can be in different variety of sectors. And I think from my engagement in the space, I think there are also like two ways to kind of look at it. I think aspirational and practical, I would say. And I think the aspirational kind of is winning at the moment. And by aspirational, I mean, so what the ReFi community has done, I think, pretty successfully is it's really made these ideas on regenerative economics more popular in tech communities, which I think is already a big contribution to our world. Is that now there are all these smart developers and tech people who probably may not have even heard or wondered about what regeneration is, and you bring these conceptual, right, beautiful ideas on regenerative economics to these tech communities, and of course it's not going to happen like just like that, and there's a lot of education that needs to happen. But I think what it brought with that, or I mean not brought, it's still in the process of breaking. And again, just to emphasize, and ReFi is still a pretty niche community. I feel like I'm like involved in these circles and all I think is like, oh my gosh, everyone knows about it. It's so big. And then, I talk to like my friends who work in the real world and they're like, Maya, what? ReFi, what? Refinancing your home or something? So I think it's, I have to like remind myself, it's still quite niche, but still, even still within the Web3 community, which in and of itself is quite niche. I think the cool thing is that ReFi is growing. And I think what, like in the aspirational kind of segment, what I described, what it is bringing is this culture shift and this realization of, okay, how can we build this tech with these regenerative ideas in mind, and like rally people, educate people, and Web3, besides the tech, and I think we chatted with you some time ago about this, what's an interesting thing about Web3 is a tech community, that it's oftentimes more of a community than technology. And people kind of unite around these like ideas of decentralization, community ownership, and which I think is wonderful. And then in terms of the practical application, right, of these like projects on the ground, like what's happening, there are like cool experimentations that are happening, and carbon copy reports on like the state of ReFi is an interesting resource that people can read. Teresa, my colleague, and I wrote a little like summary of it. And I guess like basically, but to me, what practically ReFi can do is, it's a data layer, right? It's this like this transparency coordination layer, and also a way to distribute power. So how can we use that? So for data transparency, and what data we're talking about specifically when we talk about regeneration of nature, right? Talk about nature data, and a lot of data is pretty fragmented in the kind of in the current system of climate action. There's a lot of ambiguity in the data. There's basically like no transparency, a lot of fragmentation. So I guess one of the aspirational things that people in ReFi are building towards, okay, how do we create a better way of accounting for natural data, or like the state of things, like how bad is nature doing right now, or how good is it in certain aspects, right? Then another aspect is decentralized monitoring, reporting, and verification. So like DMRV, decentralized or distributed, it's basically the set of methodologies that can be used to like verify that some of these regenerative projects did what they claimed they were supposed to do, right? Let's say if there is a project that claims that they're gonna offset carbon by planting 100 trees somewhere in a tropical forest, how do we actually make sure that happened, right? It's before, and there's a lot of experimentation happening in how do we monitor that digitally in a distributed way. And I think, and I would say from my understanding, some of these efforts are still quite early. And, there's definitely a lot of trial and error that needs to be done to make it more scalable. But I do think that the fact that there are these experimentations happening is very cool. And I think I already sort of mentioned carbon credits, right? And this idea, how do we make, I guess, like another common thread in ReFi community is how do we change the incentives, right? Or how do we make nature valuable, right? And I think that goes back to this kind of fundamental flaw in our society. It's like, how do we even value things? Like, right, we value dollars and currencies and metals, but how do we value a health of a forest, right? And of a live forest. And we don't really have good ways of measuring that. And what, these Web3 tools are hoping to allow is like built in some of these incentives, like program the value into the code, so it change kind of our value systems basically. And I think that also goes back to this culture element. The cool thing, what I like about ReFi, that people are like so like rally behind this idea that they're that we need to expand our perception of what capital is. Like capital is not just like things or money or financial capital, right? It's only like one way of thinking of capital. How can we factor natural capital, social capital, emotional capital, and all those things? So I think, again, that goes back to the definition of what regeneration means, is that holistic, right, approach to these things. And I think like two other kind of exciting things that are happening in ReFi, this idea, how do you fund some of these projects? How do you fund like a local small farmer project somewhere remotely that wants to implement more regenerative agriculture practices, right? So like plant crops in a way that doesn't deplete the soil. And oftentimes those practices are more time consuming, right? You don't get as much yield from those crops, so meaning that you are financially disadvantaged if you choose to do it in a more regenerative way. So the monocropping industrial farming always wins financially in this sense. So how can we actually change our financial systems so that we support that, right? We support what matters. And I think in that sense, there are these experimentations happening in the public goods funding, quadratic funding. There are these emerging projects. Everyone heard about Gitcoin, how you can basically support a project with your money, but it's not about the amount of money that you give that matters. It's about how many people actually support the project. So it kind of democratizes that access. Since we're talking about DeFi, these cryptocurrency tools, there are different ways to get more liquidity quicker with less fees. So besides, public funding, there are projects that exist that support things like microloans that you can instantly fund this like small projects that I just described with, because otherwise, this project, if it's in a remote country, maybe a country that does not have the best institutions, it's in resources, and maybe it could be quite corrupt, right? There are a lot of places in the world like that. So how else could this project gain that funding? And right, and funding, and why finance is important is finance is power, right? Finance and money is energy, right? And how do we give energy to the things that we want, like light energy, so that shine that light on the things for them to grow, like plants, right? Rather than let's kind of more centralized monopolistic actors decide. And so I don't know if that described what ReFi is, but I think they're again, going back to how it's an ever emerging thing, there are a lot of exciting experiments happening, but there are obviously some things that are not going so well, and that's kind of the nature of experimentation.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so what I heard almost is there's in one hand there's two things happening. There's the social element where people are coming together as communities, learning what is regeneration, why should we care about regeneration, and that's in itself hugely valuable. And then you have the technology layer where then people are coming together to actually develop tools and technology. And I think the three things that stood out for me was transparency, and taking transparency to a different level that we've had before through on-chain tooling, which allows that. Funding, which is also hugely important, and it's been happening in many ways, but adding maybe new ways of funding, and maybe getting directly to communities and people, and bypassing perhaps several layers in the middle that might distort. And then incentives, in terms of actually incentivizing behavior that stewards us or guides us towards caring about our forests and our natural resources, which perhaps one would hope that that sort of care and value was there innately, but perhaps in this process of starting to move towards in that direction, bringing in economic incentives is important there. And yeah, I think I want to talk a little bit about the social aspect, which for me is also very interesting. But on the tooling and on the technology, is there any particular like use cases today or case studies that you've seen that, as you said, they're still emerging, and they're not to say that they're scalable to be global, or that the actual end, itself, there is, we're in this process and it's going to take years. But yeah, are there any case studies, examples that you've seen that you'd love to highlight as some of this, what you just described, in action, that you think is, listeners might be worth paying attention to?
Yeah, so in the ReFi world, the OG project is Regen Network, and I already mentioned Gregory, who is the founder of Regen Network. They do an amazing job in developing some of these methodologies, like measuring that ecological assets, and measuring to make sure that these ecological assets that are being issued are actually like worthwhile, and there was regenerative action on the ground. And I think the coolest thing they did recently was launching these biodiversity credits, and they worked directly with indigenous people in, I believe, Ecuador And basically these credits are issued on chain, so there, it allows for, like I said, traceability, but also accessibility of these credits. Like oftentimes, and like previously before Web3, actually for people to participate in this like direct support of regenerative action on the ground, it has been difficult because there are a lot of these like gatekeepers, big like credit issuing organizations, that it's not like anyone can just go and purchase some of these ecological credits. So Regen Network is democratizing that, and they're also working with a variety of scientists and environmentalists who like really have the technical expertise on how to make sure that this methodology is a valid one. So they do cool work. Highly recommend. I think they like truly try to be as regenerative as possible in practice. Another one in terms of like micro financing mechanisms, I really want to highlight Ethic Hub, because I met them in Barcelona at our event, and they even brought some of the coffee that they produce. Well, not they, so they support small scale coffee farmers that use regenerative agriculture practices to grow coffee, and then they support them through these micro loans to make it possible for them. And then you drink this coffee and you see that and it feels good to know that it was produced in a way that doesn't harm nature. So like I really hope that in this future regenerative world that we live in, that this is going to be the product, the example of products that we use. And then another one that kind of hits close to home is like I mentioned, that I just went to a regenerative farm near where I live, and the cool thing they do there, it's called White Buffalo Ranch, and they're awesome. They actually do a lot of education on regenerative agriculture and farming and land stewardship. They have a regenerative vineyard there too, and it was just really cool to see the land, the property, and so it's not just like in the internet on Twitter. And the cool thing they're doing, they're actually experimenting with Web3, where they created the GRC club. So they basically took a plot of land and divided it into, measured, I can't remember how big, like squares of, I don't know, an acre. I'm really bad with these like measurements of length, and basically they took the plot of land and split it, digitally, right? They programmed it so it's in and tokenized it basically, and divided it into even parts and created NFTs out of these like plots of lands. So in order to for this land to stay regenerative and to support it, people can actually buy this NFT, and it's this unique collectible that people can have for themselves, that kind of buys them membership in this GRC club that can allow certain perks, besides supporting the project, right, by basically financing it through your contribution. You also get the perks like a bottle of wine from this regenerative vineyard that they have, some other products that they grow on the property. And I think that just like such a cool, applicable example of like what can be done even like locally, right? And it does not have to be some super crazy high tech thing. And well, it is still like pretty complex for them to report and measure that they're regenerative, right? They constantly do soil samples, and it's a never ending process really. But and it does require a lot of work, time, and energy and investment. So it's cool that there are these ways for people to support it in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I think it's awesome that you get to visit farms, and I think that's where regeneration really hits home, where you get to see and feel and touch and smell and see what it is exactly that we're actually trying to create. Um, One of the things that came up to me hearing you speak was, this measurement, and, incentives, and this need to quantify a lot of what is happening. And of course, that's a very core part of our systems as well, right? If it's not a data point, if it doesn't exist as data in the system, then it's not counted, then it's not valued. Yet at the same time, how do we see so much of nature and so much of what exists and makes us, fundamentally human is these like non-quantifiable elements? and this these kind of relationships that exist that are very difficult to quantify. And so it's like, we're kind of facing this challenge where we want to bring in tools and technology that are fundamentally centered on data and quantification and incentives, as you said. Yet at the same time, we also want to push the paradigm and move to give space where we're acting beyond data, and we're acting beyond external incentives, but through an intrinsic understanding of feelings and that bring us closer to nature and that make us value what it is that we live and we eat and we breathe. Yeah, I was wondering how you feel, how you've been feeling as you, like, look at some of these tools, and how do you approach that dynamic?
Yeah, and I mean that's definitely something that bothers me a lot, right? This like, tokenization of nature. And like on the one hand, like I see that like we need practical ways, right, to factor in externalities, right, and like move the needle, and because the economic system is so vast and we have such powerful players, like we have to use like finance as this source of power, right? And I like to think that it's this transition period and it's inevitable. Like I'm also not a fan of carbon credits either. I do think that it's not the best approach, and oftentimes people it's criticized as this buying the right to pollute, this and that. But so in the criticism is all valid, but back to like my point I made earlier, it's like so easy to criticize those things, but it's so much harder to make things happen in the real world. And as much as I want to jump into this regenerative vision I described at the beginning of the podcast tomorrow, we still have to be realistic and be rooted in material realities that we have and that we live in, and recognize that we're not gonna stop using fossil fuels today, right? There is gonna be a slow and gradual process, right, of moving away from burning fossil fuels, but it's gonna take time. So for that transition to happen, we have to have other ways to incentivize, we need to have a way to incentivize this transition, because it's going to be painful, right? Because the energy industry has a lot of resources and power. So for that, we do have to use carbon credits. But again, it's not panacea for all our problems, right? And we need to focus on the holistic way of things. And I think that if we just, use carbon credits where necessary to achieve net zero commitments, and then hopefully move beyond that, and then find ways to fund these regenerative projects on the ground. But more importantly, the third aspect is how do we change as humans, right? And going back to the consciousness, evolution of consciousness, and hopefully, like you said, we will be a different society where we don't have to measure everything for it to count. But for that, we really need to change our perception of the world, right? And that's the hardest thing to do, arguably. But I'm hopeful, and that's the cool thing about ReFi and this regenerative movement that I probably like the most, is this emphasis on inner regeneration as well. And that's why you can't just like say that you were doing these regenerative things while you view nature as something to conquer or exploit, right? Like it really starts here, and it's inspiring to see more and more people doing more inner work, self-work. And like I mentioned, some of the projects on regenerative leadership are becoming more prominent. So I'm hopeful for the future, but yes, I have a lot of reservations about ReFi and Web3 in general, and the tech communities in general. And we need to stay away from this carbon tunnel vision, right? And just like assume that we're just gonna buy carbon credits for everything and things are gonna go be great, right? How can we look holistically? How do we not fall victim to this techno solutionism mindset of like, I just need another code source, so I need just new tech, just new AI project is gonna solve it. It's like, yeah, technology like is important and useful, but it's a tool, right? And it's a tool that exists in social, political, economic contexts. So we do need to make sure we focus on changing those contexts too, right? And how do we change these social contexts, right? Through our decisions and actions that we take, and what drives our actions, our convictions, right? And our belief systems and our values. So ultimately, I think regeneration is about um, establishing those values on the inner level first.
Yeah, and beautifully put. And as you highlighted earlier as well, there was a social layer as well, where this regeneration space, the refi space, is also about just bringing so many people together in creating a community of learning and, supporting people in their own inner journeys or their own lives. And yeah, and like creating that change there. You're in the US and you're based in the West Coast, which is of course the heart of our modern technological system, Silicon Valley being there, and so many of those communities that have been a part of the building of our technology layers. Um, but now you're part of these new communities emerging. Yeah, I was wondering if you could just share like your own experiences or insight from being part of these refi communities, the kind of things that you learned, the kinds of people that you're meeting, and like what's your feeling from these pop-up cities as you mentioned, Ed City being happening right now in San Francisco, just generally this new trend of bringing together people from around the world to come and live not just for a weekend as normal conferences tend to be, but for weeks or even up to a month, and how that's might be spurring changes in how we live and think.
Well, I think refi people within kind of broader Web3 community are more my people than just regular Web3 people, I would say. Some of the, crypto bros are probably not like my vibe as much. I'm not really into this, like, oh, this new financial tool to speculate on something. But, not to diminish some of the value that these decentralized tools bring. I think it's cool to see that like a refi kind of community is pretty diverse. It's kind of like a bunch of tech nerds, environmentalists, and hippies, and I think it's like a pretty fun group to hang out with, and there's a lot you can learn from them. But like I said, it's still a pretty niche community, and I would love to see more of these regenerative visions highlighted in the bigger tech circles like the Silicon Valley. So from this is the goal, and I think the cool thing that's happening here locally in California is there's actually this new initiative that's being developed called Regenerative California, and that's sort of like the first of its kind statewide initiative. And it's not government based, but it's a nonprofit, right? And actually driven by a lot of graduates from John Fullerton's course in Regenerative Economics. But it's first of its kind effort to be like, okay, how can we scale this? How can we bring all the different stakeholders to the table and make this more of a national agenda, which I think is super cool. And that's definitely beyond sort of Web3. And I guess something I also wanted to mention that to me, refi is more than Web3. And regeneration, like I said, is this paradigm shift, and like technology is just a component to it. Refi definitely I guess I would say like refi is still going to be this like niche community within Web3 with its own culture, its own memes and projects and this and that. But I guess the idea of regenerative finance, or put it differently to not confuse people, like finance for regenerative economy, right, is so much bigger than just like crypto, obviously, right? But there are these existing investment flows that can be redirected. How can we leverage impact investment? And there are all these like new ideas being created, and which is exciting. And I'm by no means an expert on any of them, but what's cool is that I'm definitely seeing kind of this momentum and the shifts, and I think California is definitely an exciting place for it to start growing. So I'm so glad that this statewide initiative is happening, because I was like, I can't believe that we live in California, supposedly the center of innovation, and not many people know about regeneration. So I feel like it's finally changing, but slowly. So stay tuned. We'll have to do a follow-up episode a year later to see where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, regeneration being this, an infinite journey of that sort, got a loop and a cycle, and I think we We're lucky to be a part of where it is right now and have a chance to shape it. Um, you've talked a little bit about inner journeys and inner work and the kinds of value shifts that need to take place and in the world around us, and you're seeing communities emerge around that. Um, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what brought you into this space. Like, how did you start to see and value this need for regeneration in the planet? How did your own interests and perceptions start to shift? And yeah, how what has your own journey of unlearning been to bring you to this point when you are dedicating so much of your time and energy towards learning and unlearning, and how we can be more one with nature and how we can help build this regenerative world.
Yeah, well, I've always cared a lot, and I come from kind of the uh, impact work. My first job out of college was at the UN. From early age, I saw like kind of the injustices in the world, and the how and traveling the world, seeing how pollution and extraction, and I always wanted to do something about it. So I guess like I started in the traditional sort of climate activist sector, and then that's where the traditional sustainability agenda is from. It's SDGs at the UN 2030. We
You've been
have
in the
six
belly of the
years.
beast.
Yes, yes. And now people argue that the next step is going to be regenerative development goals, so RDGs. We'll see what happens. And yeah, so I've always been into doing this impact work, worked in like nonprofits most of my time. And during COVID, I guess I also really got, pretty concerned with like what's happening to the world, what's happening to my mental health as with the world as well. And there was definitely a big traumatic event that was quite challenging. And I just really noticed like the toll it had on my health and like my sanity. And through from that, I actually really got into yoga, and realized that I need to do something to just like be more embodied, like find my calm and know how to manage some of these stressful events like the pandemic. And I did a yoga teacher training, and really got into like yoga philosophy. That's why this whole like we all one like really resonates with me, like yoga lifestyle, mind body connection. And and I think that that is actually at the root of regeneration, right? And these are these ancient yogic wisdoms that have been practiced for thousands of years. There's a lot we can learn in our modern societies from that, how to actually disconnect from our computers and connect with nature and each other. And yeah, and I guess it kind of coincided, my yoga journey kind of coincided with me discovering ReFi as part of my interest in climate tech and organizations that use climate technology, my interest in Web3 as this new, decentralized layer. I was intrigued by what it can bring, but like I said, I never really fully connected with Web3 communities on their own. And when I discovered ReFi, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. And started learning about regenerative economics and the kind of outer regeneration combined with my inner generation of like my yoga practice really aligned. And I think things just started falling into place. And I feel like I started meeting more people aligned by this vision and started noticing these patterns. And went to a few of these events, and I was like, this is it. This is the new thing. And that's how it kind of started for me.
Mm. And I guess this is where the social layer of this refi community comes in, where you're able to meet people, other people are able to meet you, and have these conversations and have this sort of support uh, for helping each other, yeah, in their own understandings of how we can live more authentic lives and how we can bring that feeling and value into in the tools that we're building. And you mentioned the UN maybe shifting to regenerative development goals, and I guess that it also sort of brings up the question of how what was coming up to me was like how these the mainstream and sort of niche communities, how this interaction happens, and how niche communities maintain and keep their core values while being able to scale, and then eventually having to join the mainstream, yet mainstream has ability to sort of pull in and suck in um, these smaller communities, which then perhaps doesn't leave room for the original core to remain in. And perhaps that will be some of the challenges that you'll be navigating both in your own lives and as you're building communities in the space and studying as well.
Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge. But the cool thing is that institutions are also changing, right? And there are these like emerging, they think Web3 they're called coordinations, like these like tech communities, like I mentioned, I think earlier, that form based on their interests and values rather than right some geographical location, country, citizenship, and all of that. I think another interesting development is this focus on bioregions rather than artificial boundaries of countries, that's also a regenerative approach in and of itself, right? Listening to nature, looking at natural features, right, of a region. Like if there's a mountain range and they have a specific biological community there, we should look at them at that region as a separate entity, not and I think there are a lot of interesting, cool things happening, and I do think that's an interesting challenge to have, like these niche communities mainstream. And I mean, I actually disagree with some people who want to just stay niche, right, and just want to be this counterculture. And I see like it's like exciting, kind of romantic to be like, oh, I'm in this like counterculture community. But then like if we really want this change to be global and scale, like it's gotta go mainstream. But again, right, the challenge is how it doesn't get sucked into this like neoliberal logic. Well, it's up to us to do the work. So yeah, I don't have all the answers, but I'm hopeful that people united by this vision will prevail, and hopefully we will elevate the level of communal consciousness and raise the vibrations of this planet so that we recognize how like what beautiful and what a miracle it is to be alive on this flying beautiful living rock in the universe. Anyways, I'm going on a tangent there, but yeah, these are definitely real challenges that you bring up.
I think that was a very poetic way to bring us to 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 the end of this conversation, sort of reminding us on um, all the sort of joys that we have here, and how I think we're all grateful that these communities are here, and grateful that you're there, bringing in your energy and your ideas to help shape the kind of work that comes out of here and helps inform us. For me, sitting on the other side of the world in a way, sitting in Thailand, and trying to learn and understand who these communities are, who the people are, what are the kind of ideas that are circulating. And it's great to know that, you will be there, and you've got a podcast coming up as well. You'll be hosting, where you'll be, I guess, plugging in your own antennas into these spaces and beaming them around the world for all of us to hear. I'm excited to hear what this podcast has in store, and uh, diving deep into probably so many of the themes that you mentioned today would, all could be their own episode. I bet you're looking forward to that podcast as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for giving our new season some airtime. Yeah, myself and my colleague Teresa are taking over ReFi podcast season 4, so stay tuned. We are going to talk about a lot of these themes related to what regeneration is, regenerative economics, ReFi projects, and beyond.
Lovely. Well, we'll definitely link the podcast in the show notes, and it'll be easy to find for anyone coming into Light Forest Spaces. So thank you so much, Maya, for sharing this wonderful dive into all these different communities and tools that are happening, helping us expand our own understanding of what regeneration can mean, and a reminder also to not limit ourselves the by definitions, and to keep an open mind to the ever expanding, ever changing, world that we live in, and to keep open to that. I think that was a beautiful reminder to all of us. So, thank you, Maya.
Thanks so much, Dave, for having me. It's really an honor, and I'm so glad to see that all these kernel connections keep growing and sprouting. And another shameless plug, Kernel is having a new block. You should definitely sign up. It's a great peer learning community. So I'm really grateful for it because we met
Yeah, I
through
think
it. And
yeah, this podcast
yeah.
and is and the manifestation from the kernel connections.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to other episodes as well.
Yeah,
Let's
awesome.
build that life forest.
Love it. So there you have it. That was episode 2 of the podcast. If you liked what you heard, please comment, leave a rating, share with a friend. All of this helps with the podcast and helps with visibility. So I will see you in the next episode. Until then, take care, be well. Bye bye.